The son of the rotten river in Appalachia, the child who died every time he tried to grow. This is the story of a boy who should never have been born, in a place where bloodlines twisted back on themselves like the gnarled roots of ancient oaks, where family trees grew in circles rather than branches, and where the mountains kept secrets that would make even the hardest soul weep. Deep in the forgotten hollows of eastern Kentucky, where the mist clings to the hillsides like funeral shrouds and the creek waters run brown with the memories of coal dust, there existed a family that time had abandoned. The Harlow family had lived in the same isolated valley since 1847, when Jeremiah Harlow first claimed the land and built a cabin by the river locals would later call Rotten Creek. What started as a family became something else entirely, something that defied nature's warnings. The year was 1978, and in a ramshackle house that leaned against the mountainside like a drunk against a bar, Mary Beth Harlow gave birth to her fourth child. She was 23 years old, with hollow cheeks and eyes that had seen too much suffering for someone so young. Her husband, Thomas Harlow, was also her first cousin. His father was also his uncle. His mother was also his aunt. The family tree had become a tangled web of repeated names and doubled relationships. The baby boy came into the world silent. No cry, no breath, just a small body that seemed to struggle with the very act of existing. The midwife, an elderly woman named Cordelia who had delivered 3 generations of Harlows, looked at the infant with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. She had seen this before. Too many times before. The child's skull was misshapen, smaller than it should be, with a forehead that sloped backward at an unnatural angle. His eyes, when he finally opened them, were set too far apart, giving his face an otherworldly appearance. His hands were twisted, the fingers fused together in ways that made them useless for grasping. His legs bent at wrong angles, bones that had formed incorrectly in the womb, now condemning him to a life without walking. They named him Ezra, after his great-grandfather, who was also his great-great-uncle, who was also related to him in 4 other ways that the family had long stopped trying to explain to outsiders. Not that outsiders ever came to this part of the hollow. The dirt road leading to the Harlow property had washed out in 1963, and nobody bothered to fix it. The family wanted it that way. Isolation was protection. Isolation meant nobody asked questions about why the children looked the way they did, why so many babies were born dead, why the ones who survived often didn't make it past their 10th birthday. Ezra's first year was a battle against his own body. He couldn't feed properly, his throat muscles malformed and weak. Mary Beth had to drip milk into his mouth with a rag, watching as he struggled to swallow, watching as more dribbled out than went in. He didn't grow the way babies should. At 6 months, he was the size of a newborn. At 1 year, he had barely gained 5 pounds. Thomas would sit on the porch in the evenings, drinking moonshine that his brother-cousin Samuel made in a still hidden up the creek. He would stare at the mountains that surrounded their valley like prison walls and wonder if his grandfather had been right. Old Jeremiah Harlow, before he died in 1972, had told Thomas that the family was cursed, not by spirits or demons, but by something far more real and inescapable. Blood, he said. The blood had gone bad. The Harlows had started keeping to themselves after the Civil War, when too many men from the Hollow had died at Shiloh and Antietam. The women who were left married their cousins because there was nobody else. Then their children married each other because leaving the Hollow meant facing a world that didn't want them, didn't understand them. Generation after generation, the gene pool had shrunk until it was barely a puddle. By the time Ezra was born, genetic diversity in the Harlow family was virtually non-existent. Brothers married sisters. First cousins married each other regularly. One time, in 1956, a man married his niece, and nobody in the family saw anything wrong with it, because by then everyone was related to everyone else in multiple ways. The children born from these unions carried doubled and tripled genetic mutations, recessive genes that should have remained hidden, expressing themselves in devastating ways. Ezra's 3 older siblings were testament to this genetic catastrophe. His sister Ruby, age 7, was deaf and had severe learning disabilities. She spent her days rocking back and forth in a corner of the main room, making sounds that weren't quite words. His brother Caleb, age 5, had been born with a cleft palate so severe that he couldn't speak clearly, and his legs were so bowed that walking was painful. His other sister, May, had died at age 2 from seizures that the family didn't understand and couldn't treat. The house where the Harlows lived was falling apart, much like the family itself. The roof leaked in a dozen places. In winter, snow would blow through gaps in the walls. There was no electricity, no running water. They used an outhouse that was just a hole in the ground 50 feet from the back door. They ate squirrel meat and wild greens and whatever vegetables Mary Beth could coax from the rocky soil in the small garden patch. Confronting canal, because the stories we uncover here are the ones history tried to bury, the truths that make us understand the darkest corners of human existence, and you won't find this anywhere else. As Ezra reached his 2nd year, something terrible became apparent. He was dying, not quickly, not from any specific illness, but slowly, as if his body was giving up on the task of living. His breathing grew more labored, his skin took on a greyish pallor. His eyes, already distant and unfocused, seemed to retreat further into his malformed skull. Mary Beth knew what was happening. She had seen it before with May. The body, built wrong from the beginning, simply couldn't sustain itself. The organs, formed from genetic instructions that had been copied and recopied too many times, like a blurry photocopy of a photocopy, were failing. The heart struggled to pump blood through veins that didn't connect properly. The lungs couldn't extract enough oxygen from air because the tissue was damaged at a cellular level. The brain, trapped in a skull too small to contain it, couldn't send the right signals to keep everything working. Dr. Hendricks, the traveling physician who came through the outer edges of Appalachia once every few months, had visited the Harlow property exactly once, in 1976. He'd been horrified by what he found. He had tried to explain to Thomas and Mary Beth about genetics, about chromosomes, about why marrying relatives produced children with severe disabilities. He used words like coefficient of inbreeding and homozygous recessive alleles. The Harlows stared at him with blank expressions. Thomas had finally spoken, his voice flat and resigned. "We know our kin marry our kin, Doctor. Been that way for 100 years. Ain't nobody else out here to marry. We stay to ourselves. This is how it's always been." Dr. Hendricks had tried to convince them to leave, to move to a town where their children could get help, where future children might have a chance. Thomas had shaken his head. "This is our land. Our people are buried here. We don't leave." The doctor never came back. He sent a report to the county health department, but nothing came of it. The hollow where the Harlows lived wasn't on any official map. As far as the government was concerned, they didn't exist. By spring of 1980, Ezra was 3 years old but looked like an infant. He weighed 14 pounds. He couldn't lift his head. He couldn't make sounds beyond weak, mewling cries. His body was giving up, one system at a time. Mary Beth held him constantly, knowing that each day might be his last, singing old mountain songs that her grandmother had taught her, songs about loss and sorrow and endurance. The rotten river that ran past their property was named for its appearance. The water stained dark brown from iron and tannins, but locals whispered that it was rotten in other ways too. They said it carried the shame of the families who lived along its banks, families like the Harlows, who had turned inward on themselves until there was nothing left but sick children and early graves. There were other families in the surrounding hollows with similar stories. The Pritchards, 3 valleys over, where every child born in the last 20 years had some form of disability. The Kemps, who lived further up the mountain, where the last 5 babies had been born dead. The Shelbys, the Cordills, the Combs families, all of them connected by marriages that looped back on themselves, all of them watching their children suffer and die. These families knew what they were doing was wrong. They understood on some level that the bloodlines needed fresh mixing, but they were trapped not by the mountains, but by poverty, by lack of education, by isolation, and by pride. To leave meant admitting that their way of life had failed. To seek outsiders meant exposing themselves to judgment and ridicule. So they stayed, and the cycle continued. Ezra's condition worsened as summer approached. He developed sores that wouldn't heal because his immune system barely functioned. He had seizures that contorted his already twisted body into shapes that seemed impossible. He stopped being able to swallow even the thin broth that Mary Beth tried to feed him. On a humid July evening, when the air was so thick you could barely breathe it, Mary Beth sat on the porch, holding Ezra. Thomas sat beside her, silent. They both knew it was almost over. The boy's breathing had become irregular, sometimes stopping for long moments before starting again with a gasping rattle. Thomas spoke quietly, his words carrying across the darkening hollow. "My grandfather told me once that God punishes people for their sins. Maybe this is our punishment. All these sick babies, all these dead children, maybe we brought this on ourselves." Mary Beth rocked slowly, tears running down her weathered face. "Ain't about God," she whispered. "Ain't about punishment. It's just what happens when kin marry kin for too long. We're all carrying the same broken pieces, passing them down to our babies. Each generation gets more broken." "How do we stop it?" Thomas asked, though he knew there was no answer. "We don't," Mary Beth replied. "We're in too deep now. Even if we wanted to leave, even if we could find someone from outside to marry, we're all marked by this. Look at our children. Look at Ezra. Who would want to join a family like ours?" As darkness fell completely, Ezra took his last breath. He was 3 years and 2 months old, though he had never truly lived. His body, constructed from genetic blueprints that had been damaged beyond repair, simply gave up. Mary Beth held him for another hour before finally accepting that he was gone. They buried him the next morning in the family cemetery that sprawled across a hillside behind the house. There were dozens of graves there, many of them small, marking the resting places of children who had died young. Ezra's grave was dug by Thomas and his brother-cousin Samuel in rocky soil that resisted the shovel. No preacher came. No formal service was held. Mary Beth said a few words about hoping Ezra was at peace, about hoping he was whole in whatever came after death. Then they covered the small wooden box with dirt and went back to the house. Life continued in the hollow, unchanging and unforgiving. The seasons turned. Winter came and buried everything in snow. Spring returned and the creek flooded, washing away part of the road that nobody used anyway. Summer brought heat that made the house feel like an oven. Mary Beth didn't get pregnant again for 2 years. When she did, in 1982, she spent the entire 9 months in dread. She knew what to expect. She knew that the baby growing inside her was likely damaged, that the genetic lottery they were playing had no winning tickets left. She gave birth to another boy in February of 1983. He was born with a heart defect, a hole between the chambers that made his lips turn blue whenever he cried. His spine was curved severely, pushing his tiny rib cage out at an odd angle. His eyes were clouded with cataracts, rendering him functionally blind. They named him Josiah. He lived for 6 months before his damaged heart finally gave out. The cemetery grew. More small graves appeared on the hillside. Ruby, Ezra's sister, died at age 11 from complications related to her disabilities. Caleb made it to age 13 before a respiratory infection that his weakened body couldn't fight claimed him. Thomas started drinking more heavily. Samuel's moonshine became his constant companion. He would sit for hours, staring at nothing, trapped in a life he couldn't escape, watching his children die one by one, powerless to change anything. Mary Beth aged rapidly. By her 30th birthday, she looked 50. The constant grief, the poor nutrition, the hard labor of survival in the hollow had worn her down to nothing. Her hands shook constantly. Her hair had gone grey. She rarely spoke anymore except to respond to direct questions. The story of the Harlow family might have remained completely hidden, buried in that forgotten hollow, along with all those children, if not for a researcher from the University of Kentucky who stumbled upon records from Dr. Hendrick's 1976 visit while studying rural health disparities in Appalachia. Dr. Sarah Morrison was a geneticist interested in isolated populations and the effects of inbreeding. The brief notes from Dr. Hendricks mentioned severe genetic disorders in an isolated family, multiple generations of cousin marriage, and children with profound disabilities. It was exactly the kind of case study that could illustrate the dangers of restricted gene pools. In 1989, Dr. Morrison obtained permission from the university to conduct fieldwork in eastern Kentucky. It took her 3 months to find the hollow where the Harlows lived. Local people were reluctant to give directions, speaking in vague terms about families that kept to themselves, about places it was better not to go. Finally, an elderly woman in a town 20 miles from the Harlow property drew Dr. Morrison a rough map. But she warned her, they won't talk to you, they don't trust outsiders, and what you'll find there will break your heart. Dr. Morrison hiked into the hollow on a cold October morning. The abandoned road was barely visible, overgrown with brush and washed out in places. It took her 4 hours to cover the 6 miles from where she left her truck. When she finally reached the Harlow property, she was shocked by what she saw. The house was barely standing, patched with scraps of metal and old boards. Rusted car parts lay scattered around the yard. Chickens pecked at the dirt. A thin trail of smoke rose from a crooked chimney. She approached cautiously and knocked on the door. After a long moment it opened. Mary Beth Harlow, now 38 years old but looking decades older, stared at her with suspicious eyes. Dr. Morrison explained who she was and why she had come. She spoke about genetics and health and the possibility of helping the family understand what had happened to their children. Mary Beth listened without expression. Finally, she spoke. You want to study us like we're animals. You want to write about how we're freaks and monsters. We know what we are. We know what we've done. We don't need you telling us. Dr. Morrison tried to explain that her intentions were scientific, that understanding the genetic damage could help prevent similar situations in other isolated communities. Mary Beth shook her head slowly. Can't prevent what's already done. We got 7 babies buried on that hill. 7. All of them broken because we're all the same blood. I know that now. Took me too long to know it. But I know it. You can't help us. Nobody can. We're past help. Leave this comment now and let others know you're watching. Ezra never had a chance to live because his bloodline was his death sentence. Dr. Morrison spent 3 days camped near the hollow, trying to convince the family to participate in genetic testing that might help other families avoid similar tragedies. Thomas refused to speak to her at all. Mary Beth talked briefly on the second day, mostly about the children they had lost, about Ezra specifically. He was my baby, Mary Beth said, her voice breaking. He suffered every day of his short life, couldn't eat, couldn't breathe right, couldn't do nothing but lay there and hurt. I held him, and I loved him, but I knew I had done that to him. Me and Thomas, We made him that way. Our blood was poison. Dr. Morrison asked if they planned to have more children. Mary Beth laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. I'm done. My body's done. Thomas barely looks at me anymore. We're just waiting to die now, same as our children did, same as this whole family has been doing for 100 years. On the third day, Samuel, Thomas's brother-cousin, came out of the house and told Dr. Morrison to leave. He wasn't threatening, just firm. You don't belong here. This ain't your business. Go back to your university and leave us be. Dr. Morrison left. She published a paper in 1991 titled Genetic Consequences of Prolonged Consanguinity in an Isolated Appalachian Community. She changed the family's name and the specific location, but the details were all there. Multiple generations of first cousin and uncle-niece marriages, coefficient of inbreeding approaching levels seen only in laboratory animal colonies, children born with severe physical and cognitive disabilities, infant mortality rate of nearly 70%, average life expectancy of 12 years for those who survived birth. The paper was presented at genetics conferences. It was cited in textbooks about the dangers of inbreeding. It became a case study used to teach medical students about genetic counseling, but it changed nothing for the Harlows. Mary Beth died in 1994 at age 43 from what was likely cancer, but was never diagnosed. Thomas died 2 years later, his liver destroyed by decades of alcohol abuse. Samuel continued to live in the house alone, making moonshine and slowly losing his mind to what might have been early-onset dementia, or might have been the accumulated weight of a lifetime of sorrow. The Harlow property stands empty now. The house has partially collapsed, the roof caved in under the weight of snow in 2008. The cemetery on the hillside is overgrown with brush and saplings. Some of the small wooden crosses marking children's graves have rotted away completely, leaving no trace that those brief lives ever existed. But the story of the Harlow family continues to matter because it illustrates a fundamental truth about genetics and human biology. Inbreeding depression, the scientific term for what happened to the Harlows, is not a myth or a superstition. It is a biological reality. When close relatives reproduce, they are far more likely to share the same harmful recessive genes. When both parents carry the same damaged gene, there is a 25% chance with each pregnancy that the child will inherit both copies and express whatever disorder that gene causes. In the case of the Harlows, multiple damaged genes were being concentrated with each generation. The children weren't just suffering from one genetic disorder, but from many, overlapping and compounding. Ezra's misshapen skull, his fused fingers, his bent legs, his organ failures, all of these were caused by different genetic mutations that his parents both carried and passed on to him. Scientists estimate that every human carries between 5 and 10 seriously harmful recessive mutations. In a normal outbred population, these remain hidden because the chance of 2 unrelated people carrying the exact same harmful mutation is very low. But in families like the Harlows, where everyone is related to everyone else, these harmful mutations get concentrated. Each generation becomes more homozygous, meaning they have 2 copies of the same gene, including the damaged ones. The effects compound over time. The first generation of cousin marriage might produce relatively healthy children with only mild issues. But by the 3rd or 4th generation, the genetic load becomes catastrophic. The children are born with multiple severe problems, and many don't survive. This is not unique to the Harlows. Throughout history, isolated communities practicing endogamy have suffered similar fates. The Vadoma people of Zimbabwe, the residents of certain Pacific islands, the isolated villages in the Alps, all have documented cases of severe genetic disorders resulting from restricted gene pools. Royal families throughout Europe practiced cousin marriage for centuries to keep bloodlines pure and wealth concentrated. The result was the Spanish Habsburgs, whose final king, Charles II, was so severely disabled by genetic disorders that he could barely function. His coefficient of inbreeding was higher than if his parents had been siblings. The royal line died with him because he was infertile, another common consequence of severe inbreeding. The Harlows were not royalty. They had no wealth to protect, no bloodline to keep pure. They were just poor people trapped by circumstance and isolation, making choices that seemed necessary at the time, but that doomed their descendants. Ezra Harlow, the boy who died every time he tried to grow, represents all the victims of these closed genetic systems. He was innocent, born into suffering through no fault of his own. His body, built from corrupted instructions, could never work properly. He experienced pain and disability every moment of his brief life, and then he died, leaving nothing behind but a small grave on a hillside and a brief mention in a scientific paper. The tragedy is not just what happened to Ezra, but what happened to all the Harlow children. All the children in all the isolated families throughout Appalachia who suffered the same fate. They were victims of circumstances beyond their control, of poverty and isolation and lack of education, of desperation and limited choices. The rotten river still flows through that hollow, its waters dark and thick with sediment. No one lives along its banks anymore. The families that once called it home have either died out or moved away. The houses have collapsed, reclaimed by the forest. Nature is slowly erasing the evidence that people ever lived there. But the genetics remain. The descendants of these families, those who survived and moved to towns and cities, still carry some of those damaged genes. They may not know their family history. They may not understand why certain health problems run in their families. But the legacy of consanguinity persists, invisible but real, in their DNA. The story of Ezra Harlow and his family serves as a powerful reminder of why genetic diversity matters, why isolation is dangerous, why we must ensure that people have access to education and healthcare and opportunities that allow them to make informed choices about their lives and their families. In the end, the Harlows were not monsters or freaks, as Mary Beth feared outsiders would see them. They were human beings trapped in an impossible situation, doing the best they could with what they had, loving their children even as those children suffered and died. Thomas's question, asked on that dark evening as he held his dying son, echoes across the decades. How do we stop it? The answer for the Harlows came too late. The only way to stop it was to not start it, to maintain genetic diversity, to avoid the closed loop of consanguinity that concentrates damage with each generation. Ezra never knew his story would be told. He never knew that his short, painful life would become a lesson for others. He simply existed for 3 years and 2 months in a body that couldn't sustain him, loved by a mother who understood too late what she had done, mourned by a family that was slowly dying with him. The cemetery on the hillside holds the truth that the living tried to hide. 7 small graves, 7 children who never had a chance, 7 victims of genetics and isolation and choices made generations before they were born. Their deaths were not sudden tragedies, but slow inevitabilities, written into their DNA before they took their first breath. If you watched until here it is, because you enjoyed this story, leave a comment saying I watched until here so that I can meet you and know who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. Make sure to subscribe to this channel, because these stories expose the dark truths hidden in forgotten places, showing us the real consequences of isolation and closed bloodlines. Hit the like button if this story impacted you and made you think about the importance of genetic diversity and human connection. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that the choices we make today echo through generations. These are not just stories, they are warnings from history, lessons written in tragedy, truths that must be remembered. The legacy of the Harlow family, of Ezra and all his siblings who suffered and died too young, is a testament to human resilience and human tragedy. It shows us both the depths of parental love, as Mary Beth held her dying children and Thomas dug their graves, and the terrible consequences of circumstances that trap people in cycles they cannot break. The mountains of Appalachia still stand, beautiful and ancient and unforgiving, keeping their secrets, hiding their hollows, protecting the privacy of those who lived and died in isolation. But some stories must be told, some truths must be spoken, so that the suffering of the past can guide the choices of the future.